Hello, everyone. My name is Donna Schultz, and I'm the Senior STEM Education Outreach Manager here at IEEE. And I'm excited to introduce our next session for the first day of our STEM Summit. It's Pedagogy to Practice with your Neuro-Diverse STEM Students. Before we get started and I introduce our speaker for tonight, I want to do a few housekeeping items. First, I want to note our IEEE Tri-Engineering Fund. It's new in partnership with the IEEE Foundation, and you can see the email down below if you'd like to engage with us in that way. And next, some details about how you want to engage with the summit throughout the week and some exciting opportunities. All of the sessions for the summit will be recorded for later viewing in our replay section. So make sure if you've missed any of the sessions, you can just go to replay and watch them at your leisure. During today's presentation, make sure you post your speaker questions into the chat section, and that's at the right of the event window. And if you haven't already started, we want to make sure that you engage in our STEM Summit Challenge to win some prizes. The prizes are pretty awesome. You can see them on the right. We've got all sorts of cool STEM kits for you and a couple of great books. So make sure you check the link. It's in the Summit reception area. And the winners of the STEM Challenge will be announced on Friday. You can join our STEM Summit conversation that we're continuing throughout the week on our social media channels like Collaboratech and Facebook. And make sure if you do any posting, which we would love for you to do on your channels, you can use the #STEM Summit hashtag. And lastly, we want to make sure that you, if you're participating with us this week, that you get your certificate and the badge. And those are available for you to download on our STEM Summit reception page. And without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening. It's Elizabeth Alves. She is a K-8 STREAM teacher and academic support specialist here in the US, and she has over 20 years of experience in education and has long been inspired to integrate STEM concepts into her teaching with students as young as preschool age. It is possible, right, at the preschool age. And she has observed that incorporating a STEM focus into just about any curriculum can prove to be a positive experience for her students, particularly those with learning and emotionally disabled students. This kind of learning, this kind of engagement is really positive. Now, since then, she has built a full K-8 program incorporating STEM for disabled students that meets or exceeds standards that set forth in public schools. So without any further ado, I'm going to bring up our presenter.
Hello. Are we ready?
You are ready. Thanks, Elizabeth.
All right. Thank you. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Elizabeth. I'm going to introduce myself really quick. So currently, I am the Learning Disabilities Association President-elect. So we work with students who have learning disabilities, which is very similar and can cross-cut with neurodiverse students. So it's an area of specialty for me. And I also work for I work with the New Jersey State Special Education Advisory Council. So this council of 13 members, we advise for policies for the state, and we connect with our commissioner. I am a candidate for receiving my doctorate in organizational leadership, and that is who I am in a nutshell. Ultimately, the reason I got into STEM is because I consider myself a humanitarian at heart. I did a lot of research on figuring out how can I improve the outcomes of students who are neurodiverse, so that way they feel more confident in their lives, and they are more functioning members of society who really feel like they're also doing something good, right? And doing what's important to them, most importantly. Okay, so I want to start out by finding out where you guys are from. So if you can, in the chat box, if you can let me know, where are you joining us from today? And also, if you can just put in either inclusive, if you are currently working with students in an inclusive setting, meaning they're all kinds of students, general education students, special education, neurodiverse, no matter what kind of student you're working with, or respond with non-inclusive. And that would mean that you are specifically working with students who we can consider in special education or perhaps neurodiverse. So if you can do that now, that would be great. I just want to get a gauge to see who's here today. So while you're doing that, I'm going to talk about what we're going to focus on today. So we're going to talk a little bit about pedagogy. So what are the best practices for inclusive education when working with neurodiverse students? I'll explain to you who we're considering as neurodiverse. We're going to talk about strategies to support those students that are going to revolve around that specific pedagogy. And we're going to talk about the bigger picture. So why do we really care to engage our neurodiverse STEM students? Like, what is really important about it? Because there is a really big overall overarching lesson that we need to learn about those students today that's really important for our humanity. Okay, so we're going to start off by just talking about who is neurodiverse. So 20% or more of the world's population is considered neurodiverse. So you have students who have something called ADHD, which is attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, or you might have heard ADD, so attention deficit disorder. They don't have the hyperactivity component. You have students who perhaps are on the autism spectrum, which is huge and vast. You can have a whole host, and this is most common with ADHD. You can have a whole host of processing disorders. So we have something called dyslexia, students who perhaps they could, some students, they read really well fluently, but their comprehension is off. That is a huge component of dyslexia. It's not necessarily that they're always reading in reversals, but oftentimes if a student's having a difficult time spelling, writing things, coming up with main ideas, understanding comprehension, more often than not, they have dyslexia. We usually classify them with that. Dyscalculia is a math disorder, math-related disorder, so they have a difficult time computing. Dysgraphia has to do with their writing skills, so you can probably have excellent conversations with them. You think that they are they have great cognition, but when they're writing, they have a really difficult time writing. It's illegible, right? We have something called audio processing disorder. So again, these are all usually intelligent people, but their processing is different. So for these audio processing people, you're talking to them, they look like they're listening, they're focusing so hard, but no matter what you're saying, they have a difficult time with processing what you're saying, and then could perhaps answer a different question than that you asked, or not understand at all what you had just said. And they need a little extra support in figuring out how to work in a classroom. We also have something called Tourette's, which is oftentimes related to one of the other disorders. It's a comorbidity more often than not, instead of a standalone issue. So this is that disorder where you can have people who are repeating other things that they hear, which is parroting. They might say inappropriate things at times, that like it's an impulse control issue. We often see it with lower cognitive students, and we also see it oftentimes with the ADHD population. So it floats in both circles. We have anxiety and depression as a part of our neurodiverse as well. So when we talk about anxiety and depression, we're not talking about acute cases, so like one-time cases. We're talking about things like major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder. Those people with anxiety and depression definitely have different neurological functions. I put an asterisk by fetal alcohol spectrum disorder because it is fairly new to the research field. For a while, we were taking a look at that, and we thought that it had a lot of similar features to ADHD. But what's really important to note about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is that when the students were given medication for ADHD, they responded really adversely. And that's kind of what really brought these studies along, because they noticed that there was definitely a difference in the population that they were misdiagnosing. And they needed to make sure that they were able to better treat these students and these people in general. So if you want to learn more about that, that's certainly something that's new that you might want to consider. A lot of the same practices that we're going to use with ADHD, you'll use with the fetal alcohol spectrum disorder as well. So we also have mild cases of traumatic brain injury. So perhaps you have a student who has a sports related injury. Those students can be considered neurodiverse as well. And lastly, and not leastly, but acute and complex trauma disorders. So anyone with PTSD would be considered neurodiverse. Okay. All right. All right. So why is it important that we have inclusive STEM programming? Why do we care so much? Well, first of all, what we found is that the neurodiverse population has creativity, hyper focus, innovative thinking, tactical skill, resilience, and often one of the photographic or audiographic memory traits. So their strengths really align really well with the STEM world, and being able to be resilient through things like iterations, and being able to work with their hands and manipulate objects very quickly, especially as it relates to building things. Oftentimes I will give a student a build project and sit there with them, and they have completed it before I can even turn the instruction page. So that is definitely an awesome strength of many of these neurodiverse students. So another reason is because right now there is a huge global need. Right now, we really need to engineer with empathy, right? We know UNESCO put out a wonderful report, which we're going to get to in a little bit. But right now, we need engineers with a really high level of empathy who understand the need for diversity in the STEM fields, how to have skills that relate to sustainability. We're at a time when we really need to encourage peace, but we need to prepare for things like potential wars, economic downfall, ecologic downfall, and disease. So right now, more than ever, it's really important that we're really building up our force with students who have that strength. So additionally, we have some postgraduate outcome studies that really align well with how our neurodiverse population will be an asset, right? So in our longitudinal studies, when we look at our students who were considered neurodiverse, and I've included some of these in our presentation later, so if you want to go back and look at them at a later date, you can. So as a part of these longitudinal studies, these neurodiverse students ended up in STEM related fields, and those particular students did the best out of all the different students that were polled and tracked from the time that they were in pre-K until the time that they graduated, and then 10 years after that. So not necessarily students in engineering, but students aligned with the STEM fields. Those are the students that we know did the best. So my thought process is that we need to build from there. So If you have kids whose strengths really are in things like mechanics, well, then we should probably be trying to see if they have an interest in things like mechanical engineering, right? And so on and so forth, since there's a million different engineering fields. So that is an important reason. And then lastly, another reason why it is important is that it's an alternative for our non-engaged neurodiverse students. So the other students in that grouping, there's actually thousands upon thousands of students who have been researched with these outcome studies. The other students, some of the alternatives are really grave. So things like they're still in poverty. They're in something called supported employment, meaning they go somewhere and they need like a assistant to help them. We have a lot of students who have been either incarcerated. We have students who've become suicidal, and so on and so forth. So some of our implications for not ensuing confidence in things like this, one of my main reasons why I try so hard for with my students at early intervening with these kinds of practices, because usually when they get engaged in STEM, it's a completely different ballgame. You see that they light up, you see that they engage, you see they feel confident, and then they want to pursue more, and they're ready to take next steps. So why is there a huge deficit in neurodiverse STEM students? Why don't we have more of them either in the field, soon out of high school, or even now inside of their schools? Well, a large portion of that neurodiverse population are kept in classes that are remedial. They're on tracks that don't support the backgrounds that are needed to pursue a competitive STEM field. Oftentimes, the talented and gifted students will receive enhancements to their curriculum and not general education or special education students. We also have misunderstood behaviors that end up preventing adequate education. So a lot of the behaviors that you might see with the neurodiverse population, especially the ADHD students, end up getting penalized and being pulled out of classes, and then you really aren't able to work with them. So it's really important that what we're going to do is educate our staff, educate our teachers on how to deal with those behaviors appropriately, and really get them to work with you instead of against you. And there's, of course, varying viewpoints on what students should learn, and which students should learn it. And there's funding. So I wanted to see if you guys had any challenges that you'd like to talk about. If you do, just throw them in the chat, and we can address those. But for those who are for those who are already engaging with students who you think are already neurodiverse and you're facing challenges, if you have any, just throw it in the chat now and we can address that. But some challenges that you might see are reading challenges. You might see some math challenges. You might see some hyperactivity and attentiveness. Oftentimes, some of the behaviors that come out are going to be related to what we call fight, flight, freeze, or fib. So these students might be oppositional. They might not want to do the work at first because they're overwhelmed. They may avoid the work, or they might sometimes lie through the lessons, and say that they're doing things that they didn't actually do, because it's a response to when they don't know something. So how can you support them to bring out the most positive in them and really build their confidence? Well, primarily what you're going to do is you're going to focus on what we call metacognition, which I will explain in a couple minutes here. So through metacognition, you're going to think about these modalities of learning, and you're going to make sure that we're varying the modalities of learning, which we'll get into again. And what's really, really important with this neurodiverse population is that you become experts in executive functions. So meaning you need to learn what the executive functions are, how they, if you're teaching engineering, how they relate to that, the habits of mind, and how you can build those habits of mind with the students. So metacognition in a nutshell is the awareness and understanding of your own thought process. We used to say thinking about thinking. So how do you think about thinking? How do you draw connections? Well, it's pretty common in your lessons that you're probably going to have some sort of structure, right, to your lesson. Hopefully you have some structure to your lesson that is consistent. And what I usually advise is that in your book, like your bookends of your lesson. So the beginning of your lesson and the end of your lesson, there's something that is related to a metacognitive process, and that it is explicitly a metacognitive portion of your lesson. Okay. So some of the common things that people do to engage in metacognition, they will activate students' prior knowledge in the beginning of a lesson, right? So they'll talk to the students and they'll get them really excited about the lesson, and they'll say, well, how can you relate to this, right? They think about something that will connect them that's going on in the school or something that's going on at home. It doesn't have to be necessarily something very complicated, but in order to build their confidence and get them ready to want to learn, we need to make sure that they feel like they have a part in the lesson that they are aware of, and they know, and they're ready to move on. So this particular portion, you're not going to want to make it overly complicated. You're going to want it to be specifically something they can connect with. So you want to connect old information to new information. So a lot of people work in sphericals, right? So they go and they'll start with, especially in math, right? We have spherical learning where we will build on a concept. We talk about adding, and then we'll build that into, okay, so now we're going to add 4 sides of a object to get its perimeter, right? So you want to connect the previous lesson to the new lesson. So if you talked about something related a month ago, you want to be able to re-engage with what you talked about and get them ready for that. Another way to really help with metacognition without having to do anything at all, and kids love this, is to engage them with another peer. Peer-to-peer teaching is really great for both of the peers. They learn how to work together and engage in appropriate discussions. The person who's teaching will learn better because if you have to teach something, then you're really thinking hard about it, right? And then, of course, the person who's receiving that information will get it delivered to them on their own level from another peer who is happy to do so. And usually kids respond better to each other than they are when a teacher is going to repetitively try to teach them the same thing. And it can become a little more overwhelming. Another thing to consider is you're ending your lessons with activities that emphasize how the information is used and learned. This is really important. Really making sure that you think about what's going on right now in the world, how this information can be used. Thinking about, so for example, one of our favorite things to do here is work with little vacuums. And we build these tiny little vacuums. They're about this size. And we put things in there like marshmallows. We'll put metal in there. We put water in there. And we experiment to see what happens when you put objects into a vacuum. Well, I remember last year when we started doing this, it was one of our favorite lessons because when the students finally got down to the end of experimenting and they really understood that porous objects will inflate, we can then start talking about other concepts like outer space, right? So asking like guiding questions. So initially they did not look at the vacuum and say, oh, this has something to do with outer space, right? The teacher has to guide them to that. So, asking questions like, do we know anything else in our universe that is a vacuum? And oftentimes, if you're working with this population, they might have short-term memory, so they might not remember that they learned that, even a couple weeks ago. But oftentimes, if you ask the right questions and you keep probing, you'll be able to get them to make that connection. So once in this particular instance, once we discussed that the universe was indeed a vacuum, we talked about, well, which object that we put into our vacuum is closest to a human's body? And of course, we came down to the marshmallow, and we were able to make the connection that a person similar to a marshmallow, if they went into outer space without a gear, without their astronaut suit or something to protect them, would indeed puff up like this marshmallow. And that is why we need protective gear when we are traveling in outer space. So before this, though, the students actually thought that the main reason was because they wouldn't be able to breathe. They didn't realize that if they were to go to outer space and they didn't have a suit on and something to protect them, that something else would happen, how detrimental it would be to them. So making those kinds of connections, which can be fun, talking to kids about that kind of stuff and them lighting up and realizing why they're learning these processes really helps to really, bolster that engagement and keep them learning. So other things that you can do for metacognition, you have study skills. There's something called doodle notes that students love to do. And this is something inclusively all students love to do. Maybe not all students, but many students. So doodle notes are basically where you are, you sit, you give them a piece of paper, and they are allowed to doodle all over their paper as long as it has, as long as it's relating to the lesson. And usually the teacher will start this on the board themselves and show them things that would be applicable to the doodle. So, they're learning about the sun, so they draw a picture of the sun, they write facts inside of the sun. They might want to use different colors for different facts and things like that, and really make it vibrant and fun. I would suggest that people learn other methods like SQ3R, which I'm going to list a bunch of other methods that you guys can look up, because honestly, 45 minutes is not enough to talk about all the metacognitive practices that there are. But there's plenty of information in this presentation if you go back and take a look. Okay. So, and then lastly, I just want to make mention that the self-monitoring piece of students, especially who are neurodiverse, is really important. You really want them to be able to think about what they're doing, how it is impacting them, and how it impacts others. So something as simple as a self-monitoring check sheet that's on a table, or a quiz for them to complete about themselves that has nothing to do with academics, or some sort of tracking system to let them know what the goals are for the classroom, can really go a long way. You might have a student who can perform all the academic expectations, but they need more structure. And in order to do that, they're going to need some sort of visual aid or some sort of checklist to kind of get them started and get them into the routine. So we really want to be prescriptive about education. When we consider students in a STEM class, you're not their English teacher, you're you might be their math teacher, but you're not their basic skills teacher, right? Most people are dealing with a classroom of inclusive students, and 20% of that class are going to probably have needs that are different from the majority of the population. But it's not going to be your job to take 10, 20 steps back and then engage them into work. I think this is probably one of the most common things that throws a general education teacher off, is they believe that the student can't do it. So I've just listed a few do's and don'ts to kind of help you on your way. So you don't want to water down the program unless it's explicitly told you to do, somebody's told you to do so, meaning your supervisor, or maybe if you're in the States, you have an IEP that says that you need to alter that curriculum. If you don't have that directive, you should not water down the program. What you should do is build expectations for that student. You need to meet that student where they're at emotionally and academically. And you need to figure out a formula of their modalities that works for them. So help them realize whether or not they are a visual learner. Are they kinesthetic, or tactile? Do they work with their hands? Do they prefer to learn through their ears, right? By hearing things. But be very careful about students who say that they want to listen to music while they work. Oftentimes it is a distraction and not really very helpful. And you'll be able to tell that pretty quickly by the amount of work that they generate afterwards. So you can always try and see if giving them a set of headphones to listen to music quietly helps them. But oftentimes, if they have the choice of what to listen to, it can become more of a distraction. So you'd really have to take a look at that. I know that's a very common accommodation, but you really have to take a look at that accommodation, make sure that what they are listening to isn't so engaging that they're avoiding the work that they're doing. Okay. So a lot, again, of dealing with the neurodiverse is behavior management. Okay. And one of the best ways to avoid disruptive behavior in a classroom is to teach to fidelity, which is sometimes hard to do because there's a lot of constraints that are given to teachers nowadays. And there's a lot to do in a little amount of time. But I'm always going to encourage that you start with teaching to fidelity. Okay. So I'm sorry. So you want to, if you want to be able to manage their behaviors better, other than, teaching really well, you want to do things like minimizing cues. Okay. So when you're talking with a student and you have a lesson, you want to make sure that if they're across the room and you see that they're not on task, something as simple as walking by them and using your proximity can set them on task better than shouting across a room and drawing attention to them. You want to really make sure that you are respecting them and protecting how they are feeling in that environment. Okay. So proximity first, right? You want to guide by proximity. Sometimes just by walking by an individual, they will pick up on the message and they want to do well by you, right? They want to impress you. They want to do well. So oftentimes, if you have a good rapport with the student and you've taught to fidelity, you're going to end up walking by a student who's not on task and they will get themselves on task because they want to show you that they're ready to learn. And if they're not, you might want to take a look at why that is. What they're doing they might not be engaged in for one reason or another. And there might be an extra step that you need to take. So other things that you can do are things like hand gestures, using a soft voice, a low voice, getting on that student's eye level, having side-by-side seating when you're talking with a student. These are ways to show respect to the student while also getting them back on task. Okay. So you also want to make sure that you're giving specific feedback. And I'm going to go into a series of slides to help you with doing that with our executive functions. All right. So what this slide really is a slide to help you with naming some of their emotions. So sometimes a student might say that they're angry. This wheel will help you with figuring out what the true emotion is instead of just saying anger. Okay, so we're going to get into executive functioning. I really wanted to show you because we're kind of running out of time already. I don't know how I did that. But I want to get into some of the executive functioning strategies that you're going to want to use inside of that class. So with executive functioning, I want you to remember the acronym SOAR. I didn't make it up. This woman down here did, Susan Krieger. So what she says is to think about yourself. So with executive functioning, you're thinking about your awareness of self, your strengths, what your limitations are, your stress, your anxiety. You want to think about others. So perspectives, backgrounds, emotions. You want to align positive relationships, communication, negotiate, support, and eliminate harassment, intimidation, and bullying. And you want to put the responsibility and the decisions on the student. So these are really the goals of a teacher inside of a classroom who is operating with a high level of executive functioning. So this is just a map of what's going on in our brain with the executive functions. So managing your thoughts, feelings, and actions. So it has to do with emotional regulation, attention and focus, your processing speed, your working memory, and your initiation, your activation. And if you're not familiar, ADHD is actually considered a disorder of the executive functions. So these are your mental capacity. So these are some areas of things that you should be teaching within your classroom for students who are neurodiverse. And one way to figure out specifically, so you're not going to take a lesson and modify it so that it looks nothing like the original lesson for your 20% of your students, right? But what you're going to want to do is in your prep time, you're going to want to take a look and figure out what the lagging skills are of the students in your classroom and how it relates to their executive functions. So here are some areas that could be lagging, right? So their task management. A lot of kids have, a difficult time planning, organizing, prioritizing, their action management. Are they able to control themselves or control their bodies, control their mouths, right? Their information management. Are they able to recall, remember, use working memory? Do they have an issue with their short-term memory? Do they have attention and focus issues? Do they have emotional issues, right? Are they having outbursts and intense emotions? And are they completely frustrated and intolerant of others in the classroom? And how are they managing their output, their effort in the classroom? So are they able to have enough energy to get through the class? Are they alert? These are all things that you're going to want to assess first. And then you're going to consider giving targeted feedback. So once you figure it out with your students, which areas they really need help with the most, and maybe they need help with a little bit of everything. In the next series of slides, I'm going to give you some things that you can write down, even on like a little sticky note, right? And when you go into class, you can think about which students need this targeted feedback. So when you see someone performing a task correctly, you can give them a prompt and let them know that they are completing it correctly by being very specific with your feedback. So that way the student becomes more aware. You can also do this with other students, right? So, you have a student who's off task, but you see another student is on task. Instead of saying, great job, Susan, you should say specifically what they're doing, what they're having a great job with, right? And I'm going to give you some examples what I mean by that. So here's your unicorn student, right? So if your goal is cognitive flexibility, right? You want them to be able to process information. What you want to do is you're going to be, walking around the classroom, like I said. And what you could do is you could say, oh, I like the way that Susan just handled that transition, right? You name what it is that they are doing. So they are going from putting their notebooks away to working on an experiment, a hands-on experiment, and setting up their experiment, right? So you could say, I really like the way you were able to transition from putting your notebook away to, getting out your experiment. You're able to shift gears easily. And I think that's great. Can you help your friend do the same? Can you show him how you put your notebook away and that sort of thing? And you can use all these different goals, right, for the different executive functions. So, here are some suggestions as to what you want to see that you can then use with your students to give them targeted feedback when you see it. You can also come up with other ways to use some of these prompts and skill areas. Teachers are usually really great at coming up with games, at coming up with self-monitoring check sheets and things like that. Okay. So another thing about behaviors, you don't really have to be a behaviorist to deal with behaviors. So what I would say to most teachers when they're dealing with behaviors in a classroom that they don't want to see, so those negative behaviors, first start by going through at least 3 layers of asking yourself why. A student is not engaged. Well, why are they not engaged? They don't understand the information. Well, why don't they understand the information? Well, because it wasn't handed to them in a format that made sense to them, right? So something I would encourage teachers to do is certainly go through several layers of why before you ever plan a new preventative strategy for the classroom or for a particular student. I see that we're already at 4:45. Do we have any questions that we need to answer so far? Okay. So a classmate of my daughter, this thing is in the way. Donna, are you able to read that? Because it's the slide bar thing is in the way.
Sure. A classmate of my daughter, middle school, probably has ADHD and is talking loudly all the time during class. The teacher seems not to be able to handle the situation. Is there something the student can do to convince her at least not to disturb the learning process?
This happens pretty frequently. If this particular, so middle school is tough because this is the time when we're going to see the worst behaviors come out of students, right? They are the most immature at middle school. Believe it or not, it's not elementary school. I would say to try something like seeing if there's a set of headphones in the school that the student could use, because oftentimes when the student would wear either noise canceling headphones or just a regular pair of headphones that you would put into a computer, they're able to hear themselves back and they see just how loudly they are. Another strategy would be just to talk really quietly to the student. So when they're talking really loudly at you, you respond to them with what you want to hear, right? So you're going to talk very quietly with the student, and really model what it is that you're looking for. And usually they'll pick up on that. And of course, the teacher can, discuss this with the student after class or privately, because you wouldn't want to embarrass the student. And using headphones, it can be really inconspicuous if you're just using a regular pair of headphones instead of noise canceling ones that are those big red ones that are really obvious. You can use just a regular pair of headphones. It's going to have the same effect where the student will be able to self-regulate. I hope that helps. Do we have any other questions? What types of skills and training do teachers need to teach STEM? Well, this is probably my third year teaching explicitly STEM. But before then, I was in all the humanities. I did career ready practices, which is having to do with career skills, and doing problem and project-based learning. So you need all the same skills that a good teacher in any other class needs. But specifically, I would say that when you're teaching STEM, you need to know what to explicitly teach versus what you need to pull out of the student from a student inquiry, right? Or student iterating on a project. So things like when you want to label something, right? You want a student to know what something is, you're working with a vacuum. You want them to understand what a vacuum is. So you want to explicitly teach them what the vacuum is first in like a mini lesson. And then you want them to be able to work with it and experiment in a safe way afterwards so they can draw their own conclusions. So the skills that they need are really very similar to what you're going to need in any other classroom. And definitely resiliency. You need to be able to be resilient in a class, and certainly not be someone who stresses out about organized chaos. If students are loud and engaging in a topic, that's okay. That's actually a good thing. How can we teach pre-U students to engineer with empathy? Well, that's a great question. So reaching out to your community and seeing, what are the hot button issues in your community is one way, right? When you're going over things like current events, or you can engage with another teacher who teaches something like current events. Find out what's going on and what problems you can solve within your own local community. Other ways are if you're working with your literary teacher, right? You can connect with someone who's teaching reading skills. And if they're reading about something specific that the students are really interested in, see if there's something they can do in that topic. So, for example, we did something with like construction, right? So construction is something where you build a very large structure or sculpture with cans. And typically you would donate those cans afterwards. Well, that in and of itself it's a huge project, because you have to get somebody to sponsor you in a location. You'd have to organize with local food banks, or you can organize with Amazon or a food distributor to get the cans. And then you have to go through those engineering skills of how to build a structure and then how to get it there. And then there's a whole fundraising and philanthropy goal where you'd be able to engage with the public to spread awareness about certain concepts. So if let's say your school wants to learn about or wants to engage with the American Heart Association, which is what we did, they would build for us, we built an anatomical heart out of these cans. And then we connected with the American Heart Association. They sponsored us. We were able to collect money for them. People came and saw this huge structure. The kids got a whole bunch of recognition, and they were able to, again, they're building confidence, and they're gaining skills that are then going to help them with future outcomes. So that's a very large project and example, but you can do something really small too, like, maybe you have some veterans or soldiers, and maybe you want to engage with them by working with like claw arms and things like that, and talking about how maybe a prosthetic would help them, and how they can work together and collaborate. So do we have, okay. Can you read that one too?
No problem. Oh, no problem. Here we go. I have been fortunate to have high engagement. My biggest hurdle right now is inclusion for students who would benefit from in-class support from a paraprofessional or co-teach environment. I have students diagnosed with intellectually disabled and chromosomal deletions. They need just a little extra help, and there is only one of me. Core classes get the support, but as an elective, I do not.
Yeah, I totally understand that. So the bulk of this really has to do with inclusive settings and students who are neurodiverse. We actually don't consider the intellectually disabled in that group because they are a little bit more of a challenge. But the best thing that I could say, and I would definitely agree that you need an extra pair of hands in your classroom. But unfortunately, I know in our environment right now, we're losing a lot of educators, so it's not always possible. However, what I would say to that is definitely use that co-teaching with the other students in the classroom. So find someone who wants to engage with that student and have them pair up and work together. If you're familiar with constructivist models, that might be something that would work. That student that you're talking about would probably be an add-on student who you would give a very specific task to. So for example, maybe they are the timekeeper in your group. So instead of them taking notes or presenting, if that is not of their caliber just yet, maybe you start with something like, okay, I'm going to give you this stopwatch. When 5 minutes passes, I need you to tell them that they need to move on to their next task, and start small and give them something very specific. What advice would you give to a teacher trying to teach them with an inclusive classroom? So that's what this is all really about, right? It's all about teaching inclusively. So using those metacognitive practices inside of the classroom. I think if you have something like more specific, oh, thank you. What other examples do you have to engage students in self-monitoring? Okay. So self-monitoring can go from, not just recognizing how you're feeling inside, like the sensory aspects, and how that, makes you behave. But also thinking about like self-actualization can be really helpful. So having the student figure out their strengths, right? So very, very simply, strength surveys. There's a ton that can be found online about students figuring out, and even people, grown-ups, figuring out if they're visual learners, if they are auditory learners. And then usually those surveys will give you follow-ups. So if the student figures out that they are a visual learner or an audio learner, they can use different apps online where either they're being talked to, right? So there are plenty of text to read apps where you can insert a text. And you can, in most cases nowadays, we're able to give students digital text, which is really helpful. And we can use those apps to have them be read to aloud. So that way they're hearing it. So I would say definitely looking into other ways to figure out their strengths and what their modality is. What are some different types of modalities and how do you vary them? So modalities are, so think about reading, right? So when somebody's silently reading, they are reading with visually, but then they're processing inside of their own head, right? But if they're reading aloud, they have to read with their eyes. They also are hearing and they're speaking at the same time. So something like reading aloud can be a great one because it's engaging more than one modality at the same time. Other modalities that you have, it's your senses. Think about your senses, right? So when you're hearing, so listening to something like maybe a YouTube video. So you're watching something and you're listening to it. You might be listening to a podcast, which is oftentimes helpful and engaging for a student. You might try working with their hands. So making sure that your lessons have something that they can read, something they can listen to, even if it's just the teacher reading something back to them. So having something that they can touch, giving them opportunity to speak, where they can synthesize information and report back. But most importantly, where not everybody has to do all of those functions, where they can kind of like pick and choose and figure out what is best for them and what their best method is for learning. You can further explain the integration of these subjects and how to help this populations. So meaning how you can cross-relate in other subjects. Is that what we mean by that?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So that's kind of what I was talking about before. So but I started doing, how I even got into STREAM. I was teaching something that was cross-curricular in and of itself. And I was also teaching specifically language literacy intervention. So working with kids who had language and literacy deficits and building it, right? And we would use examples from the text all the time because they would become really engaged in a text and really have a lot of questions, or they would be able to speak to a lot of it and they would think it was cool, right? So if at any point we were able to connect with literature, we did. And now there is a lot of literature out there. So if you want to get really specific with STEM and making sure that you're able to bring literature into the STEM classroom, they do have a lot more storybooks and things that are related to STEM fields. I know Tri-Engineering, the website, and also that STEM Connect, they keep publishing almost every week a different either story series that are targeted for that either K-12 or K-8 population that talk about careers. They talk about, all sorts of STEM related fields. And it's actually, it's put into the perspective of that K-8 or K-12 population. So I would definitely say, literature is probably one of the, believe it or not, it's one of the easier ways to engage in STEM. And also I would say social studies, because you talk about social impact.
Elizabeth, thank you so much. It
You're
was
welcome.
so inspiring. I learned so much. And as you can see through our chat, both in the back end here and also on the front, there's been a lot of engagement. We've given some really great practical examples that we greatly appreciate. I know I'm excited about, is it the sketch doodle? The doodle notes.
Oh,
I
yeah.
can't wait. I think I'm already doing that, but I love that. So, and there's so many other things. I was taking copious notes. So,
yeah,
so thank you so much.
Yeah, there are templates online for Doodle Notes that you can kind of get started and see how to use them. There's so many templates online that you can start with. So yeah, definitely.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. We greatly appreciate it. And just to close out, for those of you who are still on, we don't want you to forget that we have one more session coming up later this evening called Free Your Mind, and your class will follow with Josh Berker. So join us later. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.